Holly was standing in a glass elevator on the 42nd floor of a Manhattan office building, watching the city breathe 42 stories below her, and she was thinking about a woman she had never met in person, a 71-year-old Korean grandmother named Mrs. Cho who ran a community center out of a rented storefront in Flushing, Queens, and who was, at this precise moment, 11 days away from losing her lease. It was 11:47 in the evening. The building was mostly empty. Security had waved Holly through the lobby without a second glance. She had the look of someone who belonged in back rooms, not corner offices, and she had worked very hard to cultivate that particular look. She wore a plain black blazer over a white-collared shirt, her natural hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck. A laminated badge clipped to her lapel. A canvas bag over one shoulder. She looked, from every angle, like a woman finishing a late shift and heading home. She was not finishing a late shift. She was beginning something that, if she was wrong about even one variable, one number, one name, one assumption, would end very badly for her. And she had been an accountant long enough to know that being wrong about one number was the same as being wrong about everything. The elevator moved. The city's lights swelled below her. 9 days ago, Holly had been sitting at a folding table in a church basement in Atlanta, Georgia, her home, her city, the place where she still kept an apartment because New York was never supposed to be permanent, reviewing quarterly statements for the Open Door Project, a legal aid nonprofit that provided free housing consultations and tenant rights education to low-income families across 5 boroughs. She had been a volunteer financial reviewer for the organization for 3 years. She knew its numbers the way a musician knows a piece of music she has played 100 times. Not just the notes but the breath between them. And something was wrong. A line item had moved. A routing number had changed. A sum of money, not enormous in the way that theft is theatrical, but precise in the way that theft is professional, had been redirected from the Open Door Project's operating account to a financial entity Holly did not recognize. The entity had a clean, forgettable name. 3 words. The kind of name that looks like a consulting firm and behaves like a ghost. Holly had spent 9 days following that ghost through public records, IRS filings, real estate documents, vendor contracts, and the particular archaeology of financial obfuscation that she had studied, informally and obsessively, since she was 22 years old and first understood that money doesn't disappear. It just moves to where fewer people are paying attention. The ghost led her here. To this building. To a man on the 42nd floor whose name appeared on exactly 0 public documents but whose fingerprints were on all of them. The elevator reached her floor. Holly breathed in once, slowly. She had not come here to confront anyone. She was not armed. She had no recording device. She had come to look at something she already knew was there, to confirm with her own eyes, the last measurement she needed before she began. The elevator doors opened. The hallway was quiet and clean and faintly lit. Holly stepped out. She looked both ways with the unhurried calm of someone who does this every night. She turned left. She walked toward the office at the end of the hall. She was not afraid. She was something much more precise than afraid. She was ready. Before we go any further, pause for just a second and drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching this right now? And I want to know, if you were Holly standing in that hallway, 9 days of research in your bag, no weapon, no backup, what would you do next? Tell me. I'll be reading. To understand what Holly was doing in that hallway, you need to understand what Holly's life looked like before that night, and more importantly, how she saw it. She had grown up in Atlanta's Westview neighborhood, the middle child of 3, raised by a mother who worked 2 jobs and a grandmother who kept a ledger of every dollar that came through the household. Her grandmother's ledger was not a simple notebook. It was annotated, cross-referenced. Her grandmother, Miss Adeline, had an 8th grade education and the financial intuition of a chartered analyst, and she had passed something of that to Holly in the way that certain gifts pass through families, not through explicit teaching, but through proximity and love and the quiet example of someone who took numbers seriously because she had never been able to afford not to. Holly had put herself through Georgia State University on a combination of scholarships, federal aid, and a part-time job doing bookkeeping for a Decatur barbershop whose owner paid her in cash and trusted her completely. She graduated with a degree in accounting and a minor in public policy. She passed her CPA exam on the first attempt. She worked for 4 years at a mid-size Atlanta firm doing audit work before a colleague mentioned the Open Door Project at a dinner party, and Holly, who had been looking for something she couldn't quite name, drove over to their office the following Saturday morning and asked what she could do. That was 3 years before the night in the elevator. In those 3 years she had reviewed quarterly statements, reconciled donation records, flagged 2 minor bookkeeping errors that the project's executive director corrected with genuine gratitude, and become a quietly essential part of the financial oversight structure that kept the organization honest and solvent. She attended monthly volunteer meetings. She knew the staff by name. She knew the clients by situation, if not always by name: the family in the Bronx fighting an illegal eviction, the elderly man in Crown Heights whose landlord had stopped making repairs while continuing to collect rent, the single mothers in Jackson Heights who needed someone to walk them through their rights before they could walk into a housing court without trembling. She knew Mrs. Cho's situation because a caseworker named Deshawn had mentioned it at a meeting in early September, not as a crisis but as a concern. Mrs. Cho ran a small community resource center in Flushing. English language assistance, after-school tutoring, referrals to social services for the Korean and Chinese immigrant families in the neighborhood who didn't yet know how to navigate the American bureaucracy of need. She had been in the same rented storefront for 11 years. Her lease was up for renewal. The landlord had raised the rate by an amount that was, for Mrs. Cho's center, unsurvivable without additional funding. The Open Door Project had been one of 3 organizations providing small annual grants to keep the lights on. Had been. Because when Holly sat down on a Tuesday evening in late September with the Open Door Project's most recent quarterly financial report, something was missing. Not dramatically. Not obviously. It was the kind of missing that you only notice if you already know what should be there. The way you only notice a painting is gone from a wall if you have stood in that room enough times to know the wall. A grant disbursement totaling $31,000, allocated in the previous quarter's budget to 3 community organizations including Mrs. Cho's center, had not been made. The line item existed. The allocation existed. The funds had been drawn from the operating account. But the disbursement records showed no outbound transfers to the 3 recipient organizations. Holly cross-checked. She confirmed. She checked again. The money had moved. It had simply moved somewhere else. She didn't tell anyone that night. She went home, made tea, sat at her kitchen table and began to trace. A financial trace is not glamorous work. It is the work of a mind that is willing to follow a thread through a tangle, slowly, without rushing, resisting the temptation to jump to conclusions before the data supports them. Holly was very good at this kind of patience. She had always been. In school, her teachers had noted that she was quiet and methodical. Her college professors had appreciated her precision. Her former supervising partner at the Atlanta firm had once told her that she had the best instincts he'd seen for knowing when a number was lying. She traced for 9 days. She built a map on paper in a spiral notebook she bought specifically for this purpose. She used pencil, not pen, because she expected to be wrong about things and wanted to be able to erase. She pulled public records from the New York State Department of State's Business Entity Database. She cross-referenced vendor contracts from a prior audit she had participated in. She followed registered agent trails through 2 states. She identified a holding company incorporated in Delaware with ties to a real estate management firm in Manhattan whose principal address appeared, in a different set of records, as the registered office of a financial services company whose sole managing member was listed in one document only, a property transfer filed with the New York City Department of Finance 18 months ago. That name. That address. That building. By day 7, Holly understood the general shape of what she was looking at. It was not a simple embezzlement. It was a system, patient, layered, and very old. Money from charitable sources, redirected through entities that looked legitimate because they were technically legal, landing in accounts controlled by an organization that had been doing this for at least a decade, possibly longer, and doing it with a precision that suggested professional financial oversight of a kind that legitimate organizations rarely invest in. By day 8, she understood enough about the organization's structure to identify where it was vulnerable. By day 9, she had made her decision. She was not going to the police. Not yet. Not without something that couldn't be explained away, dismissed, redirected, or buried under the kind of institutional silence that protects powerful men from inconvenient accounting. She had seen enough of the world to know that showing up at a precinct with a spiral notebook full of financial traces was not the same thing as justice. It was just information. And information alone was only the beginning. Holly needed more. She needed the kind of evidence that makes silence impossible. She was going in. She applied for the position on a Thursday. A restaurant called Celestine's occupied the ground floor of a brownstone on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, a few blocks from the park. It was the kind of restaurant that does not advertise, does not need to, and is booked 8 weeks out for dinner on any given Friday. Its clientele was discreet. Its menu changed with the season. Its private dining room, accessible through a hallway past the kitchen, was used perhaps once or twice a month for events that were not listed on any public calendar. Holly had identified Celestine's through the financial trace on day 6. A catering invoice connected the restaurant to an event that connected to the holding company that connected to the man at the center. She did not know at the time exactly what the connection meant. By day 9 she understood. Celestine's was not the organization's home. It was its living room, the place where the man at the center held the kind of dinners that conducted business without looking like business. The restaurant was hiring servers. Holly had restaurant experience. 6 months, years ago, a chain place near campus where she'd picked up extra shifts during her junior year. She put it on a revised resume she created for this purpose. Nothing false, nothing fabricated, just arranged to present a different front face than the one she wore to her accounting work. She applied under her own name. She listed her Atlanta address. She answered every interview question with the calm, competent warmth of a woman who needed the work and would be reliable and unobtrusive. She was hired within the week. She spent the next 43 days becoming furniture. Furniture is invisible in a way that people are not. You can place furniture in a room where extraordinary conversations are happening, and no one in that room will alter a single word of what they're saying because of it. Holly had understood this principle for most of her adult life, that in certain rooms certain kinds of women were not seen as participants but as fixtures, and that most people would have called that an injustice, which it was, but that it was also, in the hands of someone who understood it clearly, an instrument. She did not resent the invisibility. She had chosen it. That was the difference. In 43 days of serving tables at Celestine's, Holly mapped 4 fault lines inside the organization. The first fault line was financial. She identified it not through any document she wasn't supposed to see, but through the particular anxiety in the restaurant manager's voice during 2 phone calls she overheard while restocking a station near the hostess stand. The manager, a nervous man named Gerald who wore a tie that was always slightly crooked, spoke in a code that was not very good code, references to the schedule moving up, and the third column not matching, and he needs to know before Tuesday. Holly had spent enough years working with financial documents to recognize the syntax of someone describing a discrepancy they were afraid to report. The organization's books, she inferred, had a fault line running through them that the man at the center had not yet located. Someone below him was skimming. Not boldly, carefully, but enough that it was now becoming visible. The second fault line was relational. Over 6 weeks of serving the private dining room, Holly observed that 2 of the man at the center's regular associates, she assigned them working names, Charcoal Suit and the younger one, had recently stopped arriving together. They had previously always walked in side by side, the kind of entrance that signals alignment. Now they arrived separately, sat at opposite ends of the table, and addressed each other with a formal courtesy that is only used by people who have recently said something to each other that cannot be unsaid. What they had argued about, Holly did not know. She didn't need to. She knew that the argument existed, and that existing arguments, under the right conditions, widen. The third fault line was legal. A short article in a trade publication, which Holly had found during her original research and cross-referenced with a second source, indicated that a financial crimes unit attached to the Southern District of New York had been quietly expanding its focus toward a category of charitable fund misdirection cases. The article named no individuals, but it described, with a precision that Holly found recognizable, a pattern that matched what she had documented in her spiral notebook. Someone, somewhere in the investigative apparatus, was already looking. They just didn't yet have what Holly had. The fourth fault line was pride. It was the subtlest and in some ways the most powerful. The man at the center, she observed him at 3 dinners across the 43 days, was not a man who feared disruption from below. He had built his organization on the conviction that the people around him saw him the way he saw himself, as the final intelligence in the room, the one who understood the entire picture while everyone else held a corner of it. He was correct as far as she could tell. His associates did not challenge him. His systems were clean. His security, such as it was social, the assumption that no one on the outside could see what he saw. He had never once looked at Holly. She brought him water. She cleared his plates. She existed, in his perceptual world, as a feature of the room no more remarkable than the candlesticks or the baseboards. Which was, of course, precisely where she needed him to keep her. For 43 days she watched, listened, and mapped. She took no photographs. She recorded nothing. She carried her spiral notebook home each night in her canvas bag and sat at the small table in her rented room in Washington Heights and added, in pencil, what she had learned that day. By day 43 the map was complete. It was time to act. She arrived at Celestine's 2 hours before the private dinner was scheduled to begin. The dinner had been arranged 11 days earlier. Holly had known it was coming. She had overheard Gerald confirm the booking and had been careful to be on the schedule that night without appearing to have arranged to be on the schedule that night. She came in through the staff entrance the way she always did, changed into her server's uniform in the small cloakroom near the kitchen, greeted the sous chef, restocked the bread station, and set about the business of preparing the private dining room for 12 guests. In her canvas bag, folded inside a plain manila envelope that she had addressed to herself in Atlanta, a small precaution, the reason she would give if anyone ever asked why she was carrying personal mail to work, were 4 items. She placed them over the course of the next 90 minutes. Not hurriedly. She moved through the room the way she always moved through rooms, with a quietness that was not furtive, with a pace that looked unhurried because it was unhurried. She had measured the time. She knew that no one would be in that dining room with her between 6 and 7:30. The first item was a sealed envelope, cream-colored, the kind available at any office supply store. Inside was a 4-page financial summary, printed on plain paper, no letterhead, no signatures, no identifying information about its author, that summarized in the dry, precise language of a forensic accounting brief, the discrepancy Holly had identified in the organization's internal books. The discrepancy that pointed, unmistakably, to someone inside the organization taking money that did not belong to them. The summary identified the mechanism, the time frame, and based on Holly's reconstruction of the transaction chain, the approximate amount. It was placed in the breast pocket of an overcoat hanging on the coat rack near the private dining room entrance. The overcoat belonged to Charcoal Suit. Holly knew because she had seen him wear it at every dinner she had worked. The overcoat would be brought to the table when he arrived. The envelope would be felt and opened and read, and it would arrive in the hands of a man who was already suspicious of the people around him, in a room where trust was the operating currency. The second item was a folded index card, a single handwritten question, printed in neat block letters. Not Holly's handwriting. She had written it left-handed, which she had practiced for 2 weeks until the result looked naturally unfamiliar. The question was addressed to the younger one. It referenced, obliquely but unmistakably, the argument he had recently had with Charcoal Suit, the argument Holly had reconstructed across 6 weeks of observation, and posed a simple question about loyalty. Whose version of events exactly had been reported to the man at the center, and was it the accurate version? The note was placed beneath the younger one's place setting, under the charger plate, where it would be discovered when he sat down to dinner. A note beneath a charger plate looks like a mistake. An oversight. Something that fell there. It does not look like it was placed. It does not look like surveillance. The third item was a prepaid phone, the most basic available model, bought with cash from an electronics shop in Midtown. It was charged to full battery. One number was saved in its contacts, labeled simply attorney. That number was the direct line of a financial crimes attorney at a civil litigation firm in Lower Manhattan. A woman whose name had appeared in the trade publication Holly had found during her research, quoted in the context of an earlier case involving redirected nonprofit funds. Holly had called the attorney 3 days prior from a payphone, explained what she had and been told, carefully, precisely, in the language of a professional who had heard this kind of call before and knew exactly how to evaluate it, that if the documentation was what Holly said it was, a conversation was worth having. The attorney had not asked Holly's name. Holly had not offered it. The prepaid phone was placed in the inner pocket of a jacket belonging to one of the man at the center's financial associates, a man she privately called the administrator, who attended every dinner but rarely spoke, who kept a leather portfolio on the table in front of him and wrote things down in it throughout the evening. A man Holly had judged over 43 days of observation who was tired. Not tired in the way that boredom produces. Tired in the way that living with something heavy for too long produces. The administrator would find the phone. He would see the single number. And in a room that was already beginning to fracture, a man who was already tired might find that a door he hadn't known existed had just been opened an inch. The fourth item was a single page, folded twice. A printed news article from an investigative financial news outlet, dated 2 weeks prior, describing the expanding focus of the Southern District's Financial Crimes Unit. The article was real, Holly had found it herself, which was why it was so clean and verifiable. She had highlighted 2 paragraphs near the middle that described, in broad but recognizable terms, the category of charitable misdirection cases now under scrutiny. Beneath the highlighted text, in the same left-handed block print as the note to the younger one, she had written a single number, the amount that had been redirected from the Open Door project, and the name, not of the shell company, but of the final recipient account, which she had traced through the Delaware Incorporation records. She placed this page on the seat of the man at the center's chair, where it would be found when he sat down. Or it would be found when he stood up. Or it would be moved by his hand without his conscious attention. It did not matter precisely when he saw it. It only mattered that he would see it in a room where the other 3 items were already in motion. In a room that would, by the time the first hour was over, feel measurably less safe than it had felt at the beginning of the evening. Holly stepped back and looked at the room. 12 place settings. Crystal glasses. White linens. Candlelight. She went to restock the bread station. She moved like furniture. They began arriving at 8. Holly had worked enough private dinners to know that the arrival order at this kind of event is never accidental. Men who come early because they have been told to, or because they have something to settle before the rest arrive. Men who come late because they can afford to, or because they want to be seen entering after everyone else is seated. It is a form of language that is spoken through timing, and Holly had been reading it for 43 days. Tonight, the arrivals were slightly different from usual. The younger one came early, which was unusual. He took his seat and set his phone face down on the table beside him, and Holly, circling with a water pitcher, watched the hand that dipped beneath the edge of his place setting to adjust the napkin. She registered, without reacting, the slight pause, a quarter second longer than the pause that accompanies a simple adjustment, that meant his fingers had found the index card. She moved to the next glass. She filled it. She moved on. Gerald welcomed the guests at the door. Holly worked the room with 2 other servers, a young man named Marcus who was saving for graduate school and a woman named Priya who had worked at Celestine's for 4 years and moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had seen everything a private dining room could produce and been surprised by none of it. Priya was an excellent server and asked no questions, which made her the best possible co-worker for the kind of night Holly was engineering. Charcoal suit arrived at 8:12 precisely, and the overcoat was taken by Gerald at the door. Holly watched from across the room. Gerald hung it on the coat rack. She looked away before she could check whether she was still breathing. The man at the center arrived at 8:20. She had observed him at 3 previous dinners, but there was something about the way he entered a room that she noticed freshly each time. Not a physical quality exactly, but a quality of attention. He was a man who read a room in a single glance the way Holly read a financial statement in a single glance, and she recognized the skill because she had it herself. He walked in, paused for less than a second at the threshold, and his eyes moved around the table with the completeness of a scan. Not paranoia. Inventory. He was counting what was present, cataloging what was normal, filing everything that was not. Holly was already at the bread station, her back 3/4 turned. He sat down. She did not look at his face. She focused on the bread. The dinner moved through its first hour the way these dinners always moved. The particular formality of men who do serious business together but maintain at the table, the social choreography of men who are simply having a pleasant evening with colleagues. There was wine selection, discussed with considered interest. There were the early course appetizers, which Holly delivered to the table with the quiet efficiency she had been practicing for 43 days. There was conversation she could not hear from the stations where she stood, but whose rhythm and volume she could read the way a navigator reads the surface of water, for what it tells you about what is moving underneath. The first item was discovered at approximately 90 minutes in. She knew because Charcoal Suit excused himself from the table, which was unusual. He was not a man who stepped away from dinners. He moved toward the coat rack. She tracked this with her peripheral vision while appearing to review the dessert tray at the far end of the room. He returned to the table perhaps 4 minutes later. He did not resume the conversation he had been part of when he left. He sat with the particular stillness of a man who has just read something that rearranged the furniture of his interior world. Holly did not react. She picked up the dessert tray and walked it to the kitchen. Marcus, passing her in the corridor, gave her a brisk nod. A good service nod, the kind that means the room is running cleanly and there's nothing to worry about. She nodded back. In the kitchen, alone for 30 seconds between courses, she let out a breath she had been holding for 90 minutes. Trust, at a table like that one, is not like trust between friends. Between friends, trust is the accumulation of time and shared experience. It is slow to build and can absorb a certain quantity of disappointment before it fractures. At a table like the one in Celestine's private dining room, trust is a calculated bet. It is the conclusion that the risk of betrayal is lower than the risk of isolation, that it is safer to be inside the arrangement than outside it. The men at that table were not friends. They were participants in a shared calculation. And calculations, unlike friendships, change immediately when the inputs change. Holly understood this. She had understood it when she designed the 4 items. She had not designed them to be weapons. She had designed them to be inputs, new data introduced at the right moment, into a system that was already showing the early signs of strain. The second fault line activated at approximately 9:40. The younger one, who had been quiet for most of the dinner, quieter than usual, Holly noted, with the measuring attentiveness she had been applying to this room for 43 days, said something to charcoal suit across the table. She was too far away to hear the words. She didn't need to hear the words. She read the body language with the completeness of someone who had been studying this particular dynamic for 6 weeks. The angle of the chin, the flatness in the voice, the way charcoal suit's right hand moved from the tablecloth to his lap. The way the man sitting between them, she had always thought of him as the mediator, because he was always the one who redirected conversations that were about to leave the rails, glanced toward the man at the center. The man at the center was looking at his plate. He had found the article. Holly knew this not because she had watched him find it, she had been careful not to watch, but because of the particular quality of his stillness since he had sat down. It was a different stillness than his usual stillness. His usual stillness was the composed inactivity of a man who is in total command of a situation. This stillness was more contained, more effortful. It was the stillness of a man who was working very hard not to look like he was thinking. She refilled the water glasses. She moved to the station near the kitchen corridor. She breathed. By 10:15, the table had divided itself in a way that was visible to her even from across the room. The 12 men had not moved their chairs or changed their seats, but they had reoriented themselves in the subtle way that groups do when a shared reality has shifted, leaning toward the people they still felt certain about, creating invisible distance from the ones they didn't. Charcoal Suit and the younger one had not spoken directly to each other in nearly 30 minutes. The administrator, she caught a glimpse as she circled with a coffee service, had not opened his leather portfolio. His hands were in his lap, and he was listening to the conversation around him with a quality of inattention that suggested he was thinking about something else entirely. He had found the phone. Holly did not know this with certainty. She allowed herself a margin of error. But the administrator's posture, which across 43 dinners had been the posture of a man taking diligent notes in a portfolio he cared about, had changed into the posture of a man carrying a weight in his jacket pocket and making a decision about it. The first man to leave early did so at 10:32. At these dinners, early departures do not happen. The man at the center ran events that ended when he decided they ended, and his associates understood that leaving before that moment was a form of communication that no one made casually. Holly had worked 3 of these dinners and had never seen anyone leave before the group concluded together. The man who left was someone she had always thought of as the architect. A compact, watchful man who seemed to have a specific function in the organization that was never discussed aloud at the table but that the other men deferred to in small, consistent ways. He made a quiet remark to his nearest neighbor, said something toward the head of the table, something that looked, from 20 feet away, like an apology or an explanation, and left. Holly was at the bread station. She did not move. 7 minutes later, a second man left. The room's temperature, which Holly measured not in degrees but in the velocity and angle of its conversations, dropped. A third man departed at 10:51. The fourth fault line, the man at the center's pride, his absolute conviction that the room belonged to him, was now being tested in the most precise way Holly had been able to conceive. She had not tried to expose him. She had not tried to threaten him. She had tried to make the room around him change, to shift the geometry of the arrangement so that the certainty he had always been able to count on, the certainty that the people at his table were there because he was the most complete intelligence in it, was no longer available to him. 3 men had left a dinner that did not end early. She watched from her station as the conversation at the remaining end of the table grew quieter, more careful, more oblique. These were men who had, over many years, become expert at not saying the things that mattered. But silence is not the same as safety. Silence, in a room that has recently had 3 men removed from it, is its own form of communication. Holly cleared plates. She refilled glasses. She moved through the room with the unhurried invisibility she had spent 43 days perfecting. She was not triumphant. She was precise. There is a difference. She had thought about this night for longer than the 43 days at Celestine's. She had thought about it in different forms for most of her life. At the bread station, during the long stretch between 9:30 and 11 when the room was doing what she had designed it to do without requiring anything further from her, Holly stood in a kind of quietness that was not passive. Her hands were still. Her expression was exactly what it always was, composed, attentive, professionally neutral. But inside she was thinking with a clarity and a depth that the room, if it could have seen her, would not have recognized as thought because most people only recognize thought when it looks like urgency, like agitation, like someone visibly working something out. Holly's thinking had never looked like that. When she was 9 years old, her grandmother Miss Adeline had told her something that had taken Holly 20 years to fully understand. They had been sitting on Miss Adeline's porch after a Sunday dinner, and a neighbor had walked past and not acknowledged them. A deliberate, practiced not seeing that Holly had recognized even then as intentional, and Holly had felt for the first time, the particular sting of being made invisible against her will. Miss Adeline had watched the neighbor pass, and then she had looked at Holly and said, "Some people will try to make you nothing. The question is whether you let them decide what nothing means." Holly hadn't understood it then. She had stored it the way you store things you know will matter later. Over the next 20 years, she had come to understand what her grandmother meant, not as a piece of advice about resilience, which was how it was usually offered, but as a strategic observation. Invisibility is not inherently disempowering. Disempowerment comes from letting other people define your invisibility as your limitation, rather than as their blind spot. Holly was a black woman in America. She had moved through institutions, schools, firms, nonprofits, restaurants, in which she was consistently placed in the category of people who are helpful and present but not central, not authoritative, not the ones whose full interior life the room is designed to accommodate. She had felt this in meetings where her contributions were heard and then attributed to someone else. She had felt it in performance reviews where her precision was noted but her judgment was questioned. She had felt it in the way clients at her Atlanta firm would sometimes address themselves to her white male colleagues even when Holly was the one who had prepared every document on the table. She had felt it. She had analyzed it. And then, with the same systematic patience she brought to a financial trace, she had determined how to use it. Not in the way of someone who has capitulated, not by accepting the invisibility as a truth about herself, but by recognizing that in a world where certain kinds of women were consistently underestimated, consistently overlooked, consistently treated as peripheral, the greatest advantage available was to inhabit that periphery with absolute intention and then do what peripheral people are never expected to do. See everything. Know everything. Act at the moment of maximum leverage. At Celestine's, over 43 days, Holly had been seen by the man at the center fewer than a dozen times, and each time she had appeared in his peripheral vision as nothing more than the correct and expected part of the environment she occupied. Server. Black woman. Young. Quiet. Fine. He had been served the finest meal available without ever asking who was cooking it. He had been watched with the completeness of a forensic audit without ever knowing he was being audited. He had run a room that he was certain he controlled, and he had been correct about everything in that room except for the one variable he had forgotten to account for, the woman at the bread station. This was not justice yet. Holly was clear-eyed about that. The room was fracturing. The 4 fault lines were activating. But fracturing is not the same as accountability, and she had no interest in half measures. She thought about Mrs. Cho. She thought about the family she had met through the Open Door Project. The tenant in Crown Heights, the mothers in Jackson Heights, the man in the Bronx who had sat across from her at a folding table in a church basement and shown her a stack of letters from his landlord and been so exhausted by the effort of fighting that he'd cried quietly into his hands while she reviewed his documents and she had said nothing, because some moments call for the presence of another person and not their words. She thought about what $31,000 meant to an organization like Mrs. Cho's. Not in the abstract. Concretely. In months of rent. In hours of English tutoring. In how many families had somewhere to go on a Tuesday afternoon when the American systems around them felt impossible to navigate alone. She thought about the 20 years this man at the center had spent building his system on the assumption that the people his organization took from were not watching. That the recipients of his structured charity laundering were too busy surviving to trace the money. That the kind of person who volunteered to review nonprofit financials on a Saturday morning in a church basement in Atlanta was not the kind of person who would follow a ghost through Delaware corporate records to the 42nd floor of a Manhattan office building. She had spent her life being underestimated. She had decided a long time ago that this was not her problem. It was, however, useful. There is a kind of power that the world has never been very good at celebrating because it does not look like power from the outside. It does not announce itself. It does not stand at a podium. It does not carry a weapon or make a demand. It arrives quietly, wearing a uniform, carrying a water pitcher, watching. It builds, over days and weeks, a precise and patient architecture of understanding. And then it acts, not with fury, not with spectacle, but with the quiet confidence of someone who has done the math and is very sure of the answer. Holly was sure of the answer. She was standing at the bread station in a restaurant on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, in her server's uniform, her natural hair pinned at the nape of her neck, and she was the most dangerous person in the room. She had always known this. Tonight she was simply demonstrating it. It happened at 11:17. There were 7 men still at the table. The room, which had seated 12 at 8 o'clock, had lost 5 men to a series of departures that each carried the polite surface of a reasonable excuse. An early morning, a call waiting, a commitment remembered, and the unmistakable subtext of men extracting themselves from a table that no longer felt certain. Holly was clearing a side console near the wall, her back at a slight angle to the room, when she felt the shift in her peripheral vision that told her something had changed about the directionality of attention in the space. She knew the feeling. She had felt it once before many years ago when she was doing field work for an audit at a firm in Buckhead, and she had been reviewing files in a conference room when the company's CEO had walked in and stopped, and she'd understood from 15 feet away and without looking up that she was being assessed in a way that exceeded the ordinary assessment of a stranger in a shared space. She had kept her eyes on the file. She had not been wrong. She turned now at her own pace. The man at the center was looking directly at her. Not at the wall above her. Not at the console. Not in her general direction. At her. With the complete, focused attention of a man who has just made a decision to see something he has been choosing, until this moment, not to see. Holly had prepared for this. She had prepared for it in the abstract as a contingency, the way you prepare for weather when you are planning something that needs to happen outdoors. You account for it, you build a response, and then you hope it doesn't come and remain ready for it if it does. She had prepared a specific posture, a specific expression, a specific 7 seconds of behavior. She had rehearsed it in her room in Washington Heights until it felt not rehearsed but organic. She did not execute the rehearsed response. She looked back at him. Not with hostility. Not with challenge. Not with the performance of neutrality. She looked back at him with the quiet, complete steadiness of a woman who has nothing to hide and nothing to prove and who is, in this room, exactly who she said she was when she applied for the job, a server, competent and unobtrusive, and who is also, simultaneously, something his categories have no room for. The look lasted 4 seconds. He was the kind of man who assessed people with great precision, and she could feel the assessment happening in real time, the small recalibration that occurs when a person you have filed in one category does not, upon actual examination, stay in that category. She had seen this look before too. It was the look of a man encountering for the first time the idea that he may have miscounted. Holly spoke first. She said, at a normal conversational volume, with the professional warmth that was her armor and her instrument, "Can I bring you anything else, sir?" 6 words. A server's question. Correct to the room in every possible interpretation. A question that meant exactly what it said. A question that also meant, I see you seeing me. And I am not afraid of you. And there is nothing in this room that you can use. He held her gaze for 1 more second. Then he looked away. Holly carried the empty tray to the kitchen with the same unhurried efficiency she had carried every tray to every kitchen for 43 evenings. In the corridor, she passed Marcus, who was carrying a dessert service, and raised an eyebrow in a question. You okay? And she answered with a nod that communicated yes, fine, keep moving, because Priya was right behind him and the room needed covering and there was nothing unusual happening, nothing at all. She hung up her apron at 11:53. She signed out on the staff log. 11:58 p.m. She wrote her name in the clean, even print she had always written her name, the signature unchanged since she was a child learning to write it at Miss Adeline's kitchen table. She picked up her canvas bag. She thanked Gerald, who was already thinking about tomorrow's reservations, and said good night without looking up. She walked out of Celestine's and onto the sidewalk, and the night air of the city hit her face, and it was cold and it was real, and she walked to the subway without looking back. Not because she was afraid to look back. Because there was nothing behind her that required her attention anymore. The work was done. What came next was not hers to manage. She was home in Atlanta by the following Thursday. She had given her notice at Celestine's the morning after the dinner. A polite, clean 2 weeks' notice that she negotiated down to 3 days on the grounds that a family matter required her to return to Georgia. Gerald had been briefly irritated and then philosophical about it. Good servers came and went, and the restaurant would find another. She had thanked him sincerely, collected her final pay in cash as she had requested when she was hired, and left the Upper West Side for the last time. She spent the remaining days before her return flight making 2 additional phone calls. The first was to the financial crimes attorney whose number had been in the prepaid phone. This time Holly gave her name. She set an appointment. She overnight, from a shipping store in Midtown, paying cash, a copy of her spiral notebook, the financial trace, and 3 pages of accompanying documentation she had prepared on her laptop the night of the dinner, after she'd come home and made tea and sat at her Washington Heights table for the last time and organized everything she had into a form that another professional could read and evaluate and act on. She did not send the originals. She kept those. But the copies she sent were complete, and the attorney, when she called 2 days later, used the word actionable 3 times in 6 minutes, which Holly noted and set aside to think about later. The second call was to Deshawn at the Open Door Project. She did not explain what she had been doing for the past 43 days. She told him, in broad and careful terms, that she had reason to believe the redirected grant funds were connected to a financial pattern that was now under professional review, and that he should expect to be contacted by a civil attorney in the coming weeks, and that in the meantime he should prepare documentation of the Open Door Project's original disbursement allocation, including the allocation to Mrs. Cho's organization. He asked her 3 questions. She answered 2 of them. He thanked her, and in his voice she heard something she recognized from the faces of the clients she had sat with at church basement tables. The particular relief of a person who has been waiting for the situation to change and has been told, by someone they trust, that it is going to. She flew home on a Thursday afternoon. Atlanta received her the way Atlanta always received her. Warm even in November, familiar even after months away, the particular smell of the city's air carrying something she could not name precisely but that she associated with her grandmother's porch and the knowledge that she was from somewhere that was hers. She unpacked. She ate at her kitchen table. She slept for 10 hours. 9 days later, 9 days, the same number it had taken her to trace the ghost from the Open Door Project's quarterly statement to the 42nd floor of that Manhattan office building, 2 investigative articles were published within 24 hours of each other. The first appeared in a financial news outlet she had been tracking for months. It described, in methodical and well-sourced terms, a coordinated pattern of charitable fund misdirection connected to a network of shell companies incorporated in Delaware, with ties to at least 3 New York City area organizations in the financial services sector. No name was named. The language was precise and careful, the language of a publication that had worked this story long enough to be sure of what it was printing. The article quoted 3 sources, all anonymous. The second article appeared in a regional investigative outlet that covered financial crime in the New York metro area. This one was more specific. It referenced the Southern District's expanded investigative mandate. It quoted the financial crimes attorney, on record under her own name, describing the category of case she was now building with documentation provided by a source she declined to identify. The article used the phrase deliberate and sophisticated to describe the pattern of misdirection. It used the phrase years of coordinated action in the same paragraph. Holly read both articles at her kitchen table on a Saturday morning, drinking coffee. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel vindicated. She felt something quieter than both of those things, the feeling she had always associated with the moment a financial trace resolves, when the last number lands in the right column and the document is complete and correct and the work is done. Not excitement. Something closer to alignment. The feeling of a thing that was wrong becoming, slowly, through the application of sustained and careful effort, less wrong. She called Deshawn. He had already seen the articles. The Open Door Project had been contacted by a pro bono legal team that morning. An emergency grant from a foundation that had been made aware of the situation was being processed, enough to cover the disbursements that had been redirected, including the allocation to Mrs. Cho's organization, for the remainder of the fiscal year. Mrs. Cho's center was not going to lose its lease. Holly said something short and warm, and Deshawn laughed, and they talked for 12 minutes about the families and what this meant for them, and she listened to him talk about Mrs. Cho's response when she had been told the news, and she felt something move in her chest that she had not known she was holding until it released. She hung up and sat with her coffee in her quiet kitchen. Then she opened her laptop and pulled up a new financial filing, a different entity, a different state, a different name. Something she had noticed 3 weeks ago, during the long evenings in Washington Heights when she was waiting for the dinner at Celestine's to arrive. Something that looked, to her particular eyes and training, like the beginning of a pattern. She opened a new spiral notebook. She picked up her pencil. She began. There is a kind of power that civilizations have never been very good at celebrating. It does not arrive on horseback. It does not give speeches. It does not stand at the center of the room claiming the attention it deserves. It arrives on time in the right uniform, having done more preparation than anyone in the room suspected was possible, carrying exactly what it needs and nothing it doesn't. It observes with the completeness of someone who knows that observation is not passive, that watching carefully, with patience and intention, is itself a form of action, and one that leaves no evidence of having been taken. Holly was not unique in this. That was, in some ways, the most important thing about her. She came from a long tradition of women who did not have the luxury of being seen and so became, instead, virtuosic at seeing. Women who balanced the books of institutions that would not let them sit at the leadership table, and in doing so became the only people in those institutions who knew exactly where every dollar went. Women who raised families and kept records and filed papers and showed up on time, every time, in rooms where their presence was noted and their intelligence was not, and who, through that sustained and underestimated presence, came to understand those rooms more completely than the men who thought they owned them. These women rarely became famous. They rarely sought it. Their victories were often quiet, reported in small increments. An organization that survived a year when it shouldn't have, a family that kept its housing, a community center that did not close, a grandmother in Flushing who turned the lights on a Tuesday morning in November and welcomed in the families who needed somewhere to go. Holly understood herself to be part of this tradition. She had not invented her own approach. She had inherited it, from Miss Adeline with her annotated ledger, from the women she had watched move through the world with a grace that was not submission but strategy, from every black woman who had ever carried more than she was credited for carrying and done it without complaint because the work mattered more than the recognition. She did not begrudge the tradition. She extended it. What she had done in New York, the 9 days of tracing, the 43 days of observation, the 4 items placed with the precision of a watchmaker setting the final mechanism, was not remarkable because it was unprecedented. It was remarkable because it was precise and patient and effective, and because it had been done by a woman that a man with 20 years of carefully maintained leverage had never bothered to look at until it was already too late. He had looked at the end. He had seen her for 4 seconds as a person. And then she had walked out. That look, those 4 seconds, the moment when a man who had spent his professional life ensuring that the room belonged to him recognized for the first time that a room he thought he owned had been observed by someone he had never accounted for, was not Holly's favorite part of the story. Her favorite part was Mrs. Cho. Her favorite part was Deshawn's laugh on the phone. Her favorite part was the new spiral notebook, open on her kitchen table, pencil in hand, a fresh trace beginning. Power that announces itself is fragile. It requires maintenance. It requires the continuous performance of dominance. The dinner, the overcoat, the private room, the 12 men who arrive on time and do not leave early because leaving early means something. The other kind of power, the kind that lives in the periphery, in the accounting records, in the 43 evenings of watching and learning and waiting, that power does not require maintenance. It requires only the person who holds it to keep paying attention, to stay curious, to resist the temptation of credit and choose instead the deeper satisfaction of outcomes. Holly was already watching something new. She would not tell you about it. Not yet. But she would be there, at whatever table it required, at whatever hour, with her canvas bag and her spiral notebook and the particular quality of stillness that most people in a room would not know how to identify as the most dangerous thing in the space. She would be there. She was always already there. And the world, which has never been very good at seeing the quiet ones, would look in every direction but the right one. Right up until the moment it couldn't. The quiet ones don't ask to be seen. They wait until seeing them is the only thing left. If Holly's story moved something in you, share it. Drop a comment telling us who you were thinking about while you watched this. And if you are not yet subscribed to Forbidden Empire, this is the moment. Every week we tell the stories the world keeps trying to overlook. Hit subscribe. We will be here. And so will she.